Section 13 of From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. From the Latchkey of My Bookhouse, edited by Olive Beaupre Miller. Field, Eugene. American, 1850 to 1895. The feller who knew so much about seeing things at night, and all his life long had the heart of a boy, was born in St. Louis, but his mother died when he was 7 years old, and he was brought up by a cousin in Amherst, Massachusetts. His grandmother had high hopes of turning him out a minister, and used to offer him 9d. to write her a sermon. Oh, what ridiculous sermons he wrote! But the boy, who always had a merry twinkle in his eyes, did not grow up to be a preacher. He became a newspaper man and beloved poet of childhood. For 12 years he worked on the Chicago Daily News, but his heart was most at one with the children who played on the vacant lots near his home. And what a man he was for a joke! If he felt that an increase of salary was his due, could he go and ask for it in an ordinary way? No, not he. He must appear in the office of his chief, dressed in rags, with 4 of his children likewise in rags. They all make pleading gestures, fall on their knees, and pretend to weep, while he cries beseechingly, "Please, Mr. Stone, can't you see your way to raise my salary?" Tenderness, beauty, fun, love of fairies, witches, and childhood, all these he preserved in the midst of Chicago's workaday world. Important works: Poems of Childhood, Lullaby Land, with Trumpet and Drum. France Anatole, Anatole Thibaut, French, 1844. The light and air of Paris were the native atmosphere of little Anatole Thibaut. As a child he watched the dairy girls carrying milk and the coal heavers coal into all the houses of the Latin Quarter. He lived among the riverside streets and quays of the Seine, where his father was a poor bookseller, and his dearest friends were the wise old books. How he loved the river, too, which by day mirrored the sky and bore boats on its breast, by night decked itself with jewels and sparkling flowers. He grew up the most French of Frenchmen, and when he began to write, he boldly took the name France in place of Thibaut. Important works: Girls and Boys, Our Children, illustrated by Boutet de Moncel. Freeman, Mary E. Wilkins, American, 1862. A Massachusetts woman who portrays the quaint, homely life of New England. For years the secretary to Oliver Wendell Holmes. Jerome, a Poor Man, in Colonial Times, Young Lucretia. Galsworthy, John, English, 1867. An earnest, stick-to-itive boy was John Galsworthy, not surprisingly brilliant, but sure and steady. He comes from an old Saxon family from Devonshire, and was born at Combe in Surrey. At Harrow and Oxford he received the typical education of an English gentleman, after which he was off for several years to travel in foreign lands, to Russia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the far-off Fiji Islands. On an old-fashioned sailing ship off Australia he met the novelist Joseph Conrad, then still a sailor, and the two became fast friends. When Galsworthy returned to England he began to write novels, poems, plays. Strife, a gripping play presenting the strife between capital and labor, first really showed that he could so influence men as to bring about reform. Justice, written to reveal the hideous suffering caused by the cold wheels of English law, as it ground over criminals like some mechanical thing with neither sympathy nor intelligence, so moved Secretary Churchill that he set about reforms which have changed the English prison system. Garland Hamlin, American, 1860. Hamlin Garland was a farm boy of the Middle West, born in Wisconsin and educated in Iowa. Later he took up a claim in Dakota, but soon made off to Boston and began writing stories. Boy Life on the Prairie, The Long Trail, Klondike. Gautier, Judith. French, 1850. A French writer of plays, poems, and historical novels, daughter of Théophile Gautier, the famous novelist, and wife of Pierre Loti, another noted writer. She is a student of Oriental life and language and knows both Chinese and Japanese well. The Memoirs of a White Elephant. Goldsmith, Oliver. Irish, 1728 1774. Poor little Dr. Goldsmith, with his kindly eyes, his squat little figure, his awkward, ungainly legs, his pale, pock-marked face, and that absurd love of fine clothes. How everybody laughed at him, though sometimes with tears, and how they all loved him. Now, if his fortunes were poor, his coat was bought second hand, a tarnished green and gold with an ugly patch on the breast, but he strutted along just as proudly, and carefully hid the patch by holding his hat well over it. Now, when his fortunes were fine, he blossomed out in peach color, claret, sky blue. And yet, in spite of his vanity and 1,000 other weaknesses, what a great, generous, loving heart! Who could do other than love him? He had always a crowd of children at his heels, had little Dr. Goldsmith. His favorite enjoyment was to romp with them, the merriest and noisiest of all. Sometimes he played them a tune on his flute, sang them an Irish song, or told them stories of Irish fairies. Again he led them at blindman's buff, or a game of hunt the slipper. And if the children were very small, he would turn the hind part of his wig before and play scores of tricks to amuse them. Once he was drinking coffee with a friend, and took the friend's little 5-year-old son up tenderly on his knee. Moved by some perverse instinct, what did the tiny George Coleman do but rap him a spiteful slap on the face, and left a tingling red mark. The father indignantly took his small son and locked him up in another room, to suffer for his crime by solitary imprisonment in the dark. But soon, very soon, there was some one come to the little fellow's rescue. Some one holding a candle and smiling so tenderly. It was Dr. Goldsmith himself. Georgie sulked and sobbed at first, but Goldsmith fondled and soothed him until he began to brighten. Then the little doctor placed 3 hats on the carpet with a shilling under each. "Hey, presto, cockalorum!" he cried. And lo, when he lifted the hats, all 3 of the shillings were found in a heap under one. Such wizardry! George Coleman's heart was won. It was way back in the lonely little hamlet of Pallas in Ireland that Oliver Goldsmith was born, in a little old house that the peasant folk said stood on haunted ground, where the good folk, the fairies, held their nightly revels. But when little Noll was still very young, his father moved to a better home on the outskirts of Lissoy. This home was part parsonage and part farm, for Father Goldsmith was a country curate, large of heart and small of means, and as guileless and ignorant of the world as the dear old vicar of Wakefield. Lissoy was a charming village, too, very like sweet Auburn, loveliest village of the plain, with its sheltered little white cottages and cultivated farms. At the age of 6, little Noll was sent to the village schoolmaster, Thomas Byrne, and what a man he was! He had served in the Spanish wars, and now, when he should have been teaching the village urchins their sums, he held them spellbound with tales of his vagabond wanderings abroad, adventures of which he himself was usually the hero. To this he added tales of fairies, ghosts, and banshees, pirates, robbers, smugglers. So little Noll imbibed in his youth far more of romance than of learning. When he grew older, he was sent to a higher school at Edgeworthstown, some 20 miles from Lissoy, and on his last journey home from there, a mere stripling of 16, he met with a most absurd adventure. Little used to money was Oliver Goldsmith, and now a friend had given him a whole round golden guinea to cover his travelling expenses. Noel's head was quite turned by his riches. Off he started on horseback over a road so rough as to be impassable to coaches, determined to play the man and spend his treasure in lavish fashion. For the night he halted at Ardagh, and, intending to ask the whereabouts of the inn, he accosted the very first person he met, demanding with swaggering importance to know where was the best house in the village. Now it chanced that the man whom he thus encountered was a famous wag, and, amused by the stripling's importance, he directed him literally to the best house in the village, the family mansion of one Mr. Featherstone, a gentleman of great fortune. With all the airs in the world, up rides young Noel to the house which he thinks is an inn, and orders his horse to be led away to the stable. He then walks into the parlour, seats himself by the fire, and curtly demands to know what he can have for supper. The owner of the place, seeing the lad's whimsical mistake, and learning by chance that he was the son of an old friend, determined to carry out the joke. So young Goldsmith was fooled to the top of his bent, and permitted to have full sway all the evening. Usually Noel was shy and diffident in manner, but thinking himself now among inferiors, he grew very free and easy, showing off and making out that he was a most experienced traveller. When supper was served, he condescendingly insisted that the landlord, his wife and daughter, should sit at the table and partake of the meal with him, and when he went to bed, as a last flourish of manliness, he gave special orders that a hot cake should be ready for his breakfast. Imagine his dismay next day when he learned he had swaggered thus in the house of a private gentleman. Years later he turned this ludicrous blunder into the play She Stoops to Conquer, or The Mistakes of a Knight, which set all London laughing. But Goldsmith's school life henceforth was far from happy. He was ugly, awkward, and poor, and, moreover, little given to learning. In Trinity College, Dublin, he had to earn his way by holding the position of a servant, and tutors and boys seemed in league together to jeer at and torment him. He was extremely sensitive, too, because of his ugliness, and he added to his misery by seeking riotous friends instead of trying to shine as a student. Time and again he failed. He was to enter the ministry, but he appeared before the bishop to seek his appointment in such loud scarlet breeches that the bishop was scandalized and refused him. He failed at the law. He failed as a student of medicine. So at last he took his flute, and off he went alone for a walking tour through Flanders, France, and Switzerland. As he journeyed he played on his flute, and his tunes set the peasantry dancing, and won for him everywhere his supper and a bed. After wandering through Italy, likewise, he returned to England with no friends and no calling. At length he took a garret in a dark, miserable little back court that could only be reached by a steep flight of narrow flagstone stairs called breakneck steps. Here washings hung out all day, and frowsy women quarrelled over the wash tubs. But for the first time in his life Goldsmith set earnestly to work. He began to write, to drudge at writing, doing whatever the booksellers ordered. Now these were the days when hustling little John Newbery kept his far-famed shop in St. Paul's churchyard, where the first real children's books were displayed, bound in gilt paper and adorned with queer, old, hideous woodcuts. Goldsmith did a great deal of work for Newbery, probably editing the first real Mother Goose, and writing the tale of Goody Two Shoes. But even in such dark days Goldsmith was never bitter. He was always inviting his landlady or some poor child into his rooms to cheer them with a cake or sweetmeat, and to play for them on his flute. Moreover, all his life long he believed with childlike simplicity anything that was told him, and many a tale of woe, either true or untrue, wrung from him his last penny. Sometimes, too, with that curious unworldliness that kept him from ever truly understanding money, he gave away things he did not possess. Once his landlady came to him with a sorry tale of her husband cast into the debtors' prison for desperate need of money. Moved to the heart, Goldsmith sold a new suit of clothes which he had not paid for in order to give her the money. He was then called a knave and a sharper by those who had sold him the suit, and nearly went to the debtors' prison himself, trying to pay for what he no longer possessed. Slowly, slowly, however, his writings began to be noticed. Now he commenced to make worthy friends. At length the great Dr. Samuel Johnson himself, the foremost literary light of the day, became his friend. In 1764 he was one of a group of most remarkable men who formed a club that met regularly, henceforth at the Turk's Head Tavern. There was the big, burly, important Dr. Johnson, always followed by his humble little satellite, James Boswell, whom he was continually snubbing, and who delighted in being snubbed by the great Dr. Johnson. There was Edmund Burke, the brilliant Irish orator, to be known in the days of the American Revolution for his eloquent speech in Parliament on conciliation with the colonies. And there was the famous portrait painter, Sir Joshua Reynolds. The actor, David Garrick, was likewise a friend of the group. All these great men loved Goldy, though they often made merciless fun of him. One day word came to Dr. Johnson that Goldsmith was in great distress, and besought him to come to his lodgings at once. Off went Dr. Johnson to find that the landlady at the place where Goldsmith now lived had had him arrested for not paying his rent, and a sheriff's officer had him in custody. Goldsmith told Johnson, however, that he had the manuscript of a novel ready to print, but he could not go out to sell it because of the officer. Johnson glanced hastily over the manuscript, saw that it had merit, and went out and sold it for £60 ($300). That manuscript was the famous story, The Vicar of Wakefield. Soon after this, Goldsmith's poem, The Traveller, appeared, and it was at once pronounced so fine that his friends at the Turk's Head could scarcely believe he had written it. Now, at last, Goldsmith began to prosper and to earn a great deal of money. But alas, funny little man that he would still continue to make such ridiculous blunders. The Duke of Northumberland once sent for him to congratulate him on The Traveller. Dressed in his best, Goldsmith sallied forth to Northumberland House, preparing on the way a lot of studied compliments to recite to his noble patron. After he had waited some time in Northumberland House, a very grand personage appeared, most elegantly dressed. Taking him for the Duke, Goldy delivered unto him all the fine compliments he had prepared. To his great astonishment, the man informed him that he was only a servant, and his master would presently appear. As the Duke came in just then, he found Goldsmith so confused that, far from repeating his compliments, he could scarcely stutter a word. During his latter days, Goldsmith became famous, and had such delightful friends as the Hornecks, a widow and two lovely daughters. One of them, Miss Mary, he called affectionately the Jessamy Bride. But in spite of his fame, he never learned how to manage money, and throughout his life he remained the same simple, kind-hearted gentleman whose friends, though they smiled at his blunders, always loved him so dearly. Vicar of Wakefield, She Stoops to Conquer, The Deserted Village, The Traveller. Grahame, Kenneth. Scottish, 1858. A Scottish author, educated in England. Best known for his Golden Age and Dream of Days, stories reminiscent of childhood, and for The Wind in the Willows, a charming nature fantasy. Section 13.